Chapter 1. Standing 5 feet 11 inches tall, Garantine did not set any records for height. He did have long arms and a solid build, but good health and an able body did not seem to help Garan climb out of the rut that he currently found himself in. Garan had proudly served his country as a soldier in the United States Army. While in the Army, Garan had spent all of his free time attending college online and earning his degree. Being confined to a tiny base in Afghanistan had given Garan few other ways to safely spend his free time without succumbing to cabin fever. Upon returning stateside, Garan had earned his degree in optometry and became Dr. Tyne. After leaving the Army, Garan went to work for Kane Brothers Optometry. The Kane brothers were all optometrists and had transformed their practice into a series of franchised clinics that spread across the country. Kane Brothers offices were often found in strip malls and in many large shopping centers. Garan had gone to work for Kane Brothers wanting to gain experience and have financial stability in his life. He enjoyed his work and was good at it. Dr. Tyne had started to think about moving forward with his life when the merger brought everything to a screeching halt. The Kane Brothers had been in serious negotiations with Harris Optical. At first the merger had started smoothly. Then it happened. The Kane brothers and the lawyers for Harris had gotten into an argument over the final details of the merger, so business ground to a sudden halt. Then the Kane brothers got into arguments with each other and their clinics ended up being closed until everything was resolved. Garrison Lenz had profited from the chaos of the Kane/Harris merger. All Garan could do was helplessly watch the fighting escalate and his bank account dwindle. When he started work at Kane Brothers, he had signed an agreement stating that he would not work for a competing clinic as long as he worked for them. Garan was not working or being paid, but he was still an employee of Kane Brothers exclusively. He had thought about quitting but was unable to due to the fact that the HR people he needed to talk to were laid off as well. Garan was able to help charities for free, but he had to find another trade to put food on the table and keep a roof over his head. Garan had been able to find temporary work as a freelance photographer. The news agencies were glad to hire Garan because he had no problem venturing into dangerous situations. Garan was not a daredevil, but local crises and disasters paled in comparison to being in an actual war zone. Garan's assignments had been pretty dull until he had covered the Liberation Day riots. A group of anarchists had marched into the state capitol under the guise of peaceful protest. Once the group had gotten organized in the city, they began to loot, burn, and riot. Garan had been hired by the internet-based Hoff news agency to cover the riots. The riots lasted 3 days and Garan had been there the whole time. It was 3 days of hell. In a misguided attempt to emulate the law enforcement model used by the capital's newly allied sister city in the United Kingdom, the number of armed police officers was reduced to cripplingly low numbers. When this change in policy was coupled with the previous laws that had banned firearms within the city limits, it created a crime wave that was without rival. In the midst of the chaos was Weepy Mitz, the leader of the violent anarchist movement known as the Liberators. He had been arrested when he attempted to kidnap the president of the city's largest bank. Upon learning of their leader's arrest, the Liberators entered the city secretly armed to the teeth while showing network news crews their peaceful protest signs. When Weepy was not released, all hell broke loose. Garan had photographed burning cars, police cars riddled with bullet holes, and every type of looting and thievery imaginable. Garan had only stopped taking photos when one of the protesters had attempted to strike him with a 2x4 board. Garan had been forced to use his camera as a makeshift shield and it had been completely destroyed. He'd only been able to salvage the memory card after the state police and National Guard arrived. The editor of the Hoff news agency had despised most of the photos that Garan had taken. The news site had hoped that Garan would bring back photos of police beating the downtrodden citizenry into submission. Instead, Garan had brought them photos of an urban war zone with the wrong side winning. The editor had grudgingly selected a photo of Garan's 2x4 armed attacker and told Garan that he would buy more when Garan's photos matched the agency's editorial position. Do you really mean that Hoff News is siding with a bunch of violent anarchists? Those people aren't the harmless hippies that you pretend they are. They are only a few radical ideas short of being a terror cell. You can't lie to people like that, Garin gawked in disbelief. This thing you have with integrity will not make you many friends in this business, the editor sneered as he handed Garin a check and motioned him toward the door. You need to check your ideals and morals at the door if you want to live in this world, he called after Garin. The check had been a pittance compared to what Garin usually collected when he worked for Kane Brothers. After depositing the check in his bank and brooding over what had happened, Garin packed his camping gear, bow, and arrows into the back of his pickup and drove out into the mountains in order to decompress. The drive was long and gave Garin time to think. The problem that the world had was that it was hooked on perspective. No one was ever wrong when viewed from their perspective. The problem was that the world existed outside of selective perspective and was raging out of control. Truth was being marketed as lies and lies as truth. It was a small miracle that the world was doing as well as it was. After arriving at the campground, Garin went about the simple task of setting up camp. It had taken only a matter of a few minutes for Garin to set up his dome tent and transfer his gear into it. With that complete, Garin sat down under a shade tree and breathed in the air. The salt air that he was used to had been replaced by the scent of leaves and wildflowers. Camping during the week was a great thing. The weekend crowd had yet to arrive, and all was peaceful and quiet. After 15 minutes of relaxation, Garin decided to wander out of the campground and visit the town of Chapel Hollow. Chapel Hollow was a small town that benefited from the Sugarloaf Mountain tourist trade. Like the campground, the town was normally quiet and eagerly awaiting tourists. Chapel Hollow was known as one of many quiet towns that were nestled in the shadow of the mountains. Most weekdays the town was empty while the residents worked and looked forward to the weekend. However, Garin found the streets heavy laden with traffic and no parking spaces anywhere near the town square. Normally Garin could easily find a parking space for his large pickup when he was outside of the city. However, the overflowing parking lots offered no space for the F-250. "Hey mister, what is going on?" Garin called out to a stranger after finally finding a parking space. "They set up the mega market here," the man replied happily. The mega thrift market was a huge open-air thrift market that was televised on public TV. The show and market were based in Larson's Hollow 70 miles away. Why would it be here? "I thought that the show was filmed somewhere else," Garin commented after a moment's thought. "It normally is. They are saying that there was some big brouhaha between the show and Larson's Hollow. All I know is that early this morning all of the vendors started showing up. It's not like we are gonna turn them away," the stranger replied and then hurried on his way. The town square had been transformed into a massive open-air bazaar. Vendors manned massive tables covered with almost anything that could be imagined, manufactured, and put up for sale. After purchasing a bottle of cheerwine, Garin sat down and watched as aspiring internet personalities used their smartphones to record their thrifting adventure for later broadcast on the internet. Not far behind the amateurs walked Eddie Kiln, the host of Mega Thrift Hunter. Eddie's long gray hair was tied back in a ponytail and he wore an apron whose pockets were filled with tools that he used to inspect what he found while thrifting. Garin's parents watched the show frequently and he wondered if he could find a way to sneak on camera and wave to them. A glance at the camera crew that was trailing behind Kiln made Garin change his mind. From the sour expressions that they all wore, it was obvious that they were not taking the change in venue well. Garin's stunt might be met with something being thrown at him. It was while he was at the flea market that Garin found a new camera. The camera was nestled among various household items on display at a small stall that was squeezed between two larger vendors. The man running the stall was plump, elderly, and had a full head of silver hair. He watched as Garin eyed the camera. "What kind of camera is it?" Garin inquired. "It's an instant SLR. Simply frame your shot, push the shutter, and the camera will show you what is really going on," the man explained. "Never heard of Veritas. Is this made in China?" Garin asked suspiciously. "What kind of film does it take?" He added. "I think the film that it uses is that new Insta 120 stuff," The man answered as if it were a foreign concept that he was describing. So, it's some kind of knockoff camera? Interesting. Garen studied the camera closer. You sure it's not made in China? He added. Nope, up north. The vendor replied vaguely. Canada, eh? I'll give it a try. I have nothing to lose. Mr. Tyne, you won't be sorry. There is not another camera like that one anywhere, the man stated as if it were an indisputable fact.